A shocking incident occurred in one of the city parks. A policeman dressed in uniform and on duty suddenly showed unthinkable cruelty towards a little girl in a wheelchair. His face contorted with anger and his hand clenched into the air to strike a girl, despite her fear, looked at him with stubborn defiance. But what happened next shocked all the eyewitnesses to the core. Let's find out how events unfolded and how this terrible incident ended. This video will not leave you indifferent. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments below what you think about this situation. Your opinion is very important. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the small, quiet town of Elmsworth. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The community was tightly woven, yet the seams were frayed when it came to race. Beneath the polite smiles and cordial exchanges, there lingered a history of tension between the predominantly white police force and the black residents who had long felt the weight of discrimination. Officer Jacob Carter adjusted his sunglasses as he slowly drove his patrol car through the town's Central Park. A 10-year veteran of the force, he had grown used to the routine. The same streets, the same faces, the same minor disturbances he was tasked with managing. His father, once a police officer in a neighboring town, had raised him on a strict code: maintain order, no matter the cost. And Jacob took that to heart, even when order sometimes meant crossing lines that should have been left alone. As he made his way through the park, his eyes landed on a small group of black teenagers gathered near a bench. Among them was Kendra Davis, a 17-year-old girl in a wheelchair. Her friends were laughing, their voices light and carefree, but Jacob's eyes narrowed. He had seen this group before, and something about their presence irked him. In his mind, they were trouble waiting to happen. Kendra, with her bright smile and quick wit, was the kind of person who commanded attention. Despite the challenges she faced after the accident that left her unable to walk, she was determined to live her life fully. The wheelchair had become a part of her identity, but it didn't define her spirit. Her friends gathered around her, and their laughter filled the park. They were simply enjoying the evening, until they saw Jacob's patrol car creeping closer. "Hey, what's your problem?" one of Kendra's friends called out as Jacob approached. The tension was immediate, the kind that had built up over years of mistrust. Jacob's hand hovered near his belt. "You all got somewhere you're supposed to be?" he asked, his tone sharp, tinged with authority. Kendra's eyes met his, unflinching. "It's a public park. We're allowed to be here, aren't we?" Jacob felt a flicker of anger. The girl's defiance felt like a challenge, and in that moment, all his training and supposed professionalism evaporated. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, stepping out of the car. "You're making people uncomfortable." "We're not doing anything wrong," Kendra insisted, her voice steady but firm. "Is that right?" Jacob retorted, his face inches from hers now. The other teens tensed, sensing the hostility rising. Without another word, Jacob's hand shot out. In one swift motion, he shoved the wheelchair, knocking Kendra sideways. The force sent her toppling out of her seat, and she hit the ground hard. Gasps erupted from the crowd that had gathered. Kendra's friends rushed to help her, shouting angrily at Jacob. She lay on the ground, stunned, her palms scraped and bleeding as she struggled to sit up. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The park, the people, the air itself held its breath. "Stay back," Jacob barked, his hand now on his holster. "I don't want any trouble." But the damage was done. People began recording the scene on their phones, murmurs of outrage spreading through the small crowd. Jacob's mind raced. He had lost control, and now, all he could think of was how to spin the situation. "She resisted," he said loudly, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "This is just a misunderstanding." Kendra's friends helped her back into her wheelchair, their faces etched with anger and fear. The crowd that had gathered started to voice their discontent, their words blending into a chorus of protest against Jacob's actions. "This isn't right," someone shouted. "Leave her alone." Jacob felt the weight of the eyes on him, the cameras recording his every move. Panic crept into his chest, but he maintained his stoic expression. He knew the department would back him up, they always did. He was one of their own, after all. But what Jacob didn't know was that the department was about to undergo a significant change. Marcus Davis, a seasoned officer with a strong reputation for fairness, was set to take over as the new chief of police. And Marcus wasn't just any officer, he was Kendra's father. The department, however, had no idea of this connection, and Marcus had chosen to keep it that way for now. When the call came in about the incident at the park, Marcus was sitting in his new office, familiarizing himself with the department's files. He heard the description of the event, an officer's necessary use of force against a non-compliant suspect. His brow furrowed as he listened, his hand tightening around the phone. Then, the dispatcher mentioned the location and the identity of the young woman. His heart dropped. For a moment, Marcus felt every ounce of his resolve crumble. He could see Kendra's face, her bright eyes that mirrored his own, the smile she had inherited from her late mother. He thought of all the battles she had faced since the accident, all the strength she had shown. And now, this. His hand shook as he ended the call. He knew he had to stay composed, had to be strategic. If he reacted immediately, he risked compromising his new role. He needed to protect Kendra, but he also had to navigate the complex politics of his new position. He had to think carefully. And for that, he needed time. The next day, the town buzzed with whispers about the incident. Jacob was back on patrol, maintaining a facade of nonchalance while the tension in the community grew. He was still oblivious to the fact that the new chief of police was the father of the girl he had shoved. All he knew was that people were watching him more closely now, and he had to be cautious. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his office, wrestling with the reality of his situation. He had waited months for this position, believing that he could bring about meaningful change from within the system. But now, the stakes were personal. He had a responsibility to his daughter, but he also had a responsibility to the community and the department. Marcus reviewed Jacob's file, noting a few complaints that had been dismissed over the years. Minor things, excessive force, racial profiling, but nothing that had ever stuck. The pattern was all too familiar, and Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. Jacob was protected by the same shield of privilege and institutional loyalty that had oppressed people like Kendra for generations. He knew he had to be smart. If he openly challenged Jacob now, it would look like personal vengeance, undermining his authority before he even started. But if he did nothing, he'd betray everything he stood for, not just as a chief, but as a father. That evening, Marcus sat down with Kendra at their kitchen table. She looked at him with eyes full of hurt and anger. "Why haven't you done anything?" she demanded. "You're the chief now. You can fix this." Marcus sighed, feeling the weight of her words. "I will," he promised. "But I have to do it the right way." "The right way," Kendra repeated, her voice rising. "He pushed me out of my chair, Dad. In front of everyone. And you're talking about the right way?" Marcus reached across the table, placing his hand on hers. "I know you're angry, and I am too. But if I react without a plan, it'll look like I'm using my power for personal reasons. That'll give them an excuse to ignore everything else I want to change. I need to build a case." Kendra pulled her hand back, her eyes wet with frustration. "It feels like you're choosing your job over me." His heart ached at her words, but Marcus held his ground. "I'm choosing a future where officers like Jacob don't get away with this again. But I need you to trust me." She stared at him for a moment before wheeling away, leaving Marcus alone at the table. He watched her go, his chest tight with a mix of love and fear. He knew that to fix this, he had to walk a fine line between justice and politics, and every step would determine the future, for his daughter, his community, and his career. Marcus knew he had to dig deeper into Jacob's past if he was going to bring justice to his daughter and prevent this kind of abuse from happening again. He pulled up every file he could find on Jacob Carter, complaints, performance reviews, and incident reports. What he discovered was a pattern of behavior that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and a culture of protecting their own. Several complaints had been filed against Jacob over the years, most of them from black residents who accused him of racial profiling and excessive use of force. None of the complaints had ever resulted in any disciplinary action. They were either dismissed due to lack of evidence or marked as resolved, without any further documentation. Marcus realized that this wasn't just about Jacob, it was about a system that had enabled him. Meanwhile, Kendra's friends, outraged by the lack of response from the police department, organized a community meeting at a local church. The room filled quickly with people who had experienced similar treatment from officers like Jacob. Kendra sat near the front, listening as her friends spoke about what had happened to her and shared their own stories. It became clear that her experience wasn't an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of abuse and neglect. A young man named Trey, one of Kendra's close friends, stood up and addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about what happened to Kendra. It's about all of us. How many times have we been pushed around, stopped for no reason, or treated like we don't belong in our own town? We can't stay silent anymore." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Kendra, feeling the collective energy of the room, found her voice. "We have to make them listen," she said. "We need to show them that we won't accept this anymore." As the community mobilized, Marcus watched from the sidelines, still trying to balance his roles as both a father and chief of police. He began reaching out to trusted officers within the department, those he knew shared his vision for fair policing. He quietly built a team to investigate not just Jacob's actions but also the department's mishandling of similar incidents. It was a risk. Any leak could compromise the investigation, but Marcus knew he had no choice. Meanwhile, Jacob was beginning to feel the heat. The community's reaction, coupled with the whispers among his colleagues about the new chief's intentions, put him on edge. He still didn't know that Marcus was Kendra's father, but he sensed that he was being watched more closely than ever. Each day felt like a countdown to something he couldn't predict. Jacob's unease grew as he found himself increasingly isolated within the department. Officers he had once considered allies were now keeping their distance, their support shifting as rumors circulated. Some whispered that the new chief was planning to clean house, targeting those with any stain on their records. Others speculated that Marcus had a personal vendetta, but no one knew the full story yet. Then, Marcus decided it was time to make his move. He arranged a meeting with Jacob under the pretext of a routine check-in, wanting to gauge the man who had hurt his daughter. The two men sat in Marcus's office, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Marcus kept his tone professional, masking his anger behind a facade of calm authority. "Officer Carter," Marcus began, "I've been reviewing the complaints filed against you over the years. It seems there's a pattern that's concerning." Jacob felt a chill but kept his face neutral. "All those complaints were dismissed, sir. No evidence." "That may be true," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. "But sometimes, no evidence just means no one was willing to look hard enough." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've decided to reopen some of those cases." Jacob's eyes flickered with anxiety. "With all due respect, Chief, I've always done my job by the book." "I'm sure you have your reasons for believing that," Marcus said, his voice cool. "But what you call by the book looks a lot like profiling and excessive force when you read the reports. I need you to understand that things are going to change under my leadership." Jacob nodded, but inside, he was panicking. He felt the walls closing in, the ground beneath him becoming unsteady. For the first time, he considered that maybe this wasn't just about a new boss making changes. Maybe it was something deeper. Meanwhile, Marcus began implementing new community engagement initiatives, assigning officers like Jacob to areas they had rarely patrolled before, neighborhoods with predominantly Black and Hispanic residents. Marcus's hope was to expose officers like Jacob to the communities they often saw as problems rather than people. He monitored Jacob's interactions closely, noting every minor slip and instance of tension. As Jacob faced these new assignments, he struggled. He had never been comfortable interacting with the town's Black community beyond issuing orders or making arrests. Now he was expected to engage, to listen, and to build trust, a concept foreign to him. His resentment grew, and so did his suspicion that this was more than just a test of his professional conduct. The community's outcry continued to grow, and Kendra's friends, led by Trey, organized protests and rallies demanding justice. They gathered outside the police station, chanting Kendra's name and calling for accountability. The local media picked up the story, shining a spotlight on Elmsworth and the mounting tensions between its police force and the community. Inside the station, Marcus leveraged this momentum. He called for an internal review of all past incidents involving complaints against officers for racial bias and excessive force. It was an unprecedented move, one that sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers grumbled, accusing Marcus of caving to public pressure. Others, however, saw it as an opportunity to correct past wrongs. As Marcus continued his quiet investigation, he discovered that Jacob's file was just the tip of the iceberg. The more he dug, the more he realized that the culture of the department had been built around protecting its own at the expense of justice. Evidence had been tampered with, complaints suppressed, and officers like Jacob were shielded by layers of bureaucracy. He shared his findings with his small team of trusted officers, instructing them to keep everything confidential. He knew that if word got out too soon, the backlash could undermine their efforts. The goal was to build a solid case, one that couldn't be dismissed as a personal attack or a witch hunt. Outside the station, Kendra's friends continued their activism. They organized marches, held community meetings, and started an online campaign that drew attention from activists beyond Elmsworth. Kendra, encouraged by the support, became more vocal. She joined her friends at the rallies, sharing her story and calling for change. Her courage inspired others who had faced similar injustices to come forward. At one of the rallies, Kendra delivered a powerful speech. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice strong despite the quiver of emotion. "This is about every person in this town who has been treated like they don't belong. It's about every life that's been devalued, every person who has been hurt by those who are supposed to protect us. We deserve better." Her words echoed through the crowd, and Marcus watched from the sidelines, feeling a swell of pride mixed with a deep, painful awareness of the complexity of his position. He knew Kendra was right, and he felt the pressure to act decisively. Meanwhile, Jacob's anxiety grew. He knew his actions were being scrutinized, and the community's protests felt like a countdown to his own undoing. He confided in a fellow officer, expressing his fears. "They're out to get me, man," he said, his voice low and tense. "Ever since Davis took over, it's like they're building a case." His colleague shrugged. "Maybe it's just business. Maybe he's just trying to show he's tough on everyone." But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he watched Kendra speak at the rally on the evening news, her face familiar yet still not quite placing her, he felt a sinking feeling in his gut. Who was she really, and why did it feel like her presence in his life was more significant than he could understand? The walls continued to close in, and the pieces of the puzzle began to align. Marcus knew he was getting closer to the moment when the truth would come to light, but he also knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The next steps would determine whether justice would finally be served or if the old patterns of silence and protection would prevail once again. The community's protests reached a fever pitch, and the investigation into Jacob's actions intensified. Marcus knew the time had come to reveal the truth. After weeks of gathering evidence, he called Jacob into his office for a meeting. This time, there would be no ambiguity. Jacob entered the office, his expression guarded. He could feel the tension in the air. Marcus's eyes were cold, focused, and as Jacob took his seat, he felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. "Officer Carter," Marcus began, his voice measured but intense. "I think it's time you understand who I am and what's really at stake here." Jacob furrowed his brow, his mind racing. "Sir, I don't understand. I thought this was about protocol." Marcus cut him off, leaning forward. "This isn't just about protocol. This is about accountability. The young woman you pushed out of her wheelchair in the park, that was my daughter, Kendra." Jacob's face went pale. The room seemed to close in around him as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of what he had done, and to whom, settled heavily on his shoulders. Marcus watched as the truth dawned on Jacob. "You didn't just assault an innocent young woman. You attacked my daughter, in front of witnesses, and then tried to justify your actions." Jacob's mind raced, searching for a way to defend himself. I didn't know, Chief. I swear, I didn't know she was your daughter. It was just, things got heated. I was just trying to keep control." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said, his voice rising with restrained anger. "You see people like my daughter as threats, even when they're not doing anything wrong. And it's not just her. I've reviewed your history, Officer Carter. This is a pattern that ends today." Jacob slumped in his chair, the color draining from his face. "What's going to happen to me?" Marcus's expression was unyielding. "You have two options. You can resign now, quietly, and this department will process your departure. Or, I move forward with a full investigation. And trust me, once all your misconduct is out in the open, you'll be facing more than just a loss of your badge." Jacob felt trapped. His career, his reputation, Everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes. He could see that Marcus was giving him a chance, but it felt like a poisoned offer. "And if I resign, what happens to me then?" "You'll lose your job, but you won't face charges," Marcus replied, his tone cold. "That's more than you deserve, considering what you've done." Jacob left Marcus's office feeling like his world was collapsing. He had a choice to make: take the deal and resign, or risk everything by fighting back. He knew some of his colleagues would stand with him if he claimed he was being unfairly targeted. After all, they had each other's backs. But he also knew that Marcus was serious. The chief was prepared to go to war over this. In his desperation, Jacob began reaching out to his colleagues, trying to rally support. A few stood by him, insisting that Marcus was pushing too hard, but many others kept their distance, unwilling to risk their own careers. The department was divided, and it became clear that Jacob couldn't count on the loyalty he had once relied on. Meanwhile, Marcus remained steadfast. He continued his investigation, widening the scope beyond Jacob. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that systemic change was necessary. He held press conferences, stating his commitment to transparency and promising the community that the department would be held accountable. Kendra, seeing her father's efforts, felt a mix of relief and conflict. She appreciated that he was finally taking action, but the emotional scars remained. She couldn't forget how vulnerable and powerless she had felt when Jacob had shoved her. And though her father was doing everything he could, she wondered if real justice was even possible in a system that had failed so many for so long. Tensions reached their peak when Kendra's friends organized a major protest outside the police station. Hundreds of people gathered, chanting slogans and holding signs demanding justice. Kendra, now an emblematic figure in the movement, spoke again, her voice amplified by a megaphone. "This isn't just about one officer," she said, her voice strong but carrying the weight of her pain. "This is about a system that allows officers like him to act without consequences. We need real change, and we won't stop until we get it." As Marcus watched from his office window, he felt a swell of pride mixed with fear. He knew the backlash from within the department was mounting. Jacob had filed a complaint, claiming he was being unfairly targeted because of the chief's personal connection to the case. It was a gamble, and it gained traction among some of the officers who resented Marcus's reforms. The department announced Jacob's suspension as the investigation moved into its final stages. The community's protests intensified, but Marcus remained resolute, determined to see the process through to its conclusion. He knew the risks. Jacob's claims of being unfairly targeted could complicate things, but he also knew that backing down now would undermine everything he was trying to achieve. As the investigation delved into Jacob's history, more evidence emerged. It wasn't just the incident with Kendra. Other cases surfaced where Jacob had used excessive force and had gone unpunished. Marcus's team gathered testimonies from victims and witnesses who had been ignored for years. Slowly but surely, the case against Jacob became ironclad. With the evidence mounting, the district attorney agreed to press charges against Jacob for assault and misconduct. It was a landmark decision for Elmsworth, one that sent shockwaves through the department and the community. Jacob's trial date was set, and the town braced for the fallout. At the same time, Marcus pushed forward with reforms in the department. He instituted mandatory training programs focused on de-escalation and anti-bias practices, despite resistance from some officers who felt the changes were punitive. He also established a new community advisory board, giving residents a voice in the department's policies and decisions. Kendra, still feeling the weight of her trauma but encouraged by the changes she saw, began working with her father to heal their relationship. They attended community meetings together, and Kendra found herself speaking out more, advocating not only for justice in her own case but for systemic reforms that would protect others. The day of Jacob's trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with reporters, community members, and police officers. Jacob, flanked by his lawyer, looked pale and distant, the reality of his situation finally settling in. The trial was tense, with testimonies from Kendra and other victims painting a stark picture of Jacob's abuse of power. The jury deliberated, and when the verdict came, it was clear: Jacob was found guilty of assault and misconduct. The decision marked a victory for Kendra and her community, but Marcus knew the work was far from over. One conviction wasn't enough to fix a broken system. Marcus continued his efforts as chief, using the trial's outcome as a springboard to introduce further reforms. Some officers left the force, unable to accept the changes, But Marcus remained focused on building a new culture, one that valued accountability, transparency, and community trust. He hired more officers from diverse backgrounds and expanded community policing initiatives, ensuring that the police would be seen not as adversaries but as allies. Kendra, now an influential voice in the town, found herself on a new path. She became involved in local activism, working with organizations that promoted disability rights and racial justice. She and her father mended their relationship, finding common ground in their shared goal of building a better, more inclusive community. In the final scene, Kendra attends a community event where Marcus speaks about the progress the town has made. He acknowledges the challenges they still face but expresses hope for the future. As he steps off the stage, he joins Kendra, who smiles at him with a new sense of pride. Together, they walk through the park, now a symbol of the town's struggle and resilience, knowing that while the fight for justice isn't over, they are no longer alone in their journey. The chains that once held them back were beginning to break, one step at a time.